All right. Welcome to the Rainbow Theatre in Whistler for this, the fourth event in the Whistler Institute's Global Perspective Series. And welcome to those who are joining us from home for tonight's conversation on the climate emergency with Dr. Mark Jaccard. This event is being held on the traditional unceded shared territories of the Squamish and Lil'wat nations who have lived here since time immemorial. We are honored to live, work, and learn on their land. My name's Dave Williamson. I'm the chair of the Whistler Institute board. The Whistler Institute is a registered Canadian charity dedicated to influencing change and inspiring minds through education and thought leadership. The Global Perspectives Speaker Series started in 2019, and we have hosted important online and in-person discussions that address global issues with a local perspective.
Hi, I'm Todd. How are you?
And tonight continues with that theme. Tonight's talk about tackling the climate crisis could not be more timely after the heat domes, devastating wildfires, flooding, and landslides that have severely impacted many BC communities over the past year. Before we get started, though, I would like to thank our event sponsors. Their support enables the Whistler Institute to continue to provide access to critical educational content. First, I would like to thank the Whistler Institute's generous founders for their year-round support. Charles and Dale Young of the Raindrop Foundation, Sue and Bob Adams, the McLean Group and Blackcomb Helicopters, Leslie and Shep Alexander, Dwayne Jackson, and Bill Kunzweiler. Without their early and ongoing support, we would not be here today. The Whistler Institute's Executive Director, Suki Shane, is in the audience tonight at the back. I think if she might wave her hand there so everyone can see her. Please don't hesitate to connect with Suki at the end of this event to find out more about our Founders Program. Thank you to our silver sponsors. We have some video messages from Cascade Environmental Resource Group, RDC Fine Homes, and BD Living. Thanks also to our bronze sponsors, Peak News Magazine, Cronin Family, Whistler Lake Conservation Association, Race and Company LLP, and Stark Architecture. I think there's some videos. Who's that guy? While we're waiting for that to come up, I'd also like to thank Encore, Tourism Whistler, and Carumba Restaurant for their support in producing this event. Those of you who were lucky enough to secure dinner experience tickets will have a chance to continue the conversation over dinner at Carumba tonight. I think is there a video clip? I can do the housekeeping notes. While they're getting that up, they'll wave to me when they've got it ready to go. The housekeeping notes. So we expect tonight's talk to run for about 45 minutes before we invite the Whistler's Mayor Jack Crompton to join with Dr. Jaccard on the stage to moderate the question and answer session until about 7:30. To avoid passing of microphones and audience movement during the Q&A.
I'm Todd. How are you?
And I'm Candace Rose Taylor. We are the principals here at Cascade Environmental, and we are a proud sponsor of this event.
As an environmental consultancy, we regularly see and deal with the impacts of climate change in our region, and we're excited to hear about our path to climate success and how we can all contribute to meeting that challenge.
Hi there, everyone. I'm Bob Deeks from RDC Fine Homes, and I want to welcome you all to tonight's presentation on a very important and, I must say, timely subject. We at RDC Fine Homes are proud to be able to support such an urgent discussion regarding climate change and the decisions that need to be made. Many thanks to the Whistler Institute for their leadership and many education opportunities they offer the community, such as the presentation tonight. Myself and my staff are proud to be able to support such a wonderful organization that is so well aligned with our brand and core values. All right.
Hi, my name is Nicholas Dhaliwal of BD Living. BD is proud to be sponsoring this event tonight and hopes that we all can take away a few key tips on how to be better citizens to achieve climate success.
Okay. So back to avoiding the passing of microphones and audience movement during the Q&A. We're going to use Slido to enable the audience in the theater and those at home to submit their questions and engage in the discussion. So using your phone, visit slido.com and enter the code 252469 to submit your question. Vote on the questions that you feel are most pressing. The URL and code should be on the big screen as well. Yes, it is. There we are. Now, let me tell you a story about how Whistlerites became fans of Dr. Jaccard. Back in around 2008, there was a panel discussion here in the conference center, and Mark was one of the panelists. When his time to speak came, he stood up and quickly dispatched the notions of peak oil and clean coal in a dramatic fashion, with a supply graph that was about 20 feet long, jumping across multiple whiteboards in the room. Then he introduced the concept of taxing carbon, and that was it. He certainly won me over, and I think everybody in the room has been following him ever since. That's why I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say tonight. Without further ado, I invite to the stage tonight's speaker, Dr. Mark Jaccard, Distinguished Professor and Director of the School of Resource and Environmental Management at Simon Fraser University.
Thanks, Dave. They're going to put something up. I'm turned on, I can tell. Hi, everyone. A couple of things I need to do is recalibrate. So people talked about I would start speaking at 6 and speak for 45 minutes, and then there'd be 45 minutes for questions because we're ending at 7:30. So I just need to know, are we still ending at 7:30? Because I'll cut my talk a little short. Suki, someone? No, I don't want the questions to be short. That's the most fun. You'll be stopping at 7:30? Perfect. Okay, thanks. The second thing is, they think I needed to have a fun experience of coordinating two things at once, and I can do it. Well, you'll be the judge. Okay, thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy, privileged to be here. It's fun that you talk about an event. Am I doing that? You're gonna do this? Okay. Talking at an event here at Whistler. I've actually spoken many times at Whistler, but not for quite a few years now. So I was trying to think which thing did I say then? But it sounds like that was fine. And I love the opportunity to come here. So I'm really grateful to the Whistler Institute for organizing this. Thank you very, very much. I'm going to get started. So I might. Okay. So the goal of my book, end of this talk. Okay. Sorry, they're all right. Well, I'll get the hang of this, don't worry. They're not synced, so I'm doing it like this. And is to help climate concerned citizens detect deliberate delusions and inadvertent myths, and I'm going to turn it on all of us. Elect climate sincere politicians, so you got to be able to identify them who do effective policy, and then also think personally about dramatically cutting your own emissions and what that might mean. And I'm basing it on my book, The Citizen's Guide to Climate Success. But the themes of that book, as Dave even talked about a couple of topics right there that I talked about. I was doing those issues were there for a long time. So I've been dealing with the issues that are in the book, which just came out in 2020. I unfortunately will still be with us 5 years from now and maybe even 10 years from now. Things are getting better, and I want to give a real message of hope tonight. And I'll explain what I mean by that. But at the same time, some of the things that slow us down with climate change have been around for 20 years and they're still there. So I remember the COVID happened and people said to me, the media said, well, okay, we did some stuff with you about your book and so on. And then, but then we got into 2021 and they said, well, have you written another book? And I tried to explain, no, this book is good. Like it'll be fine 5 years from now. The message is not changing. So what is that message? Well, the first is I think there's some other challenge they want for me. Also that one of them doesn't work. Right. All right, so this thing seems intermittent. I've hit all 4 buttons. Don't trust me. Okay, so I have a key. Okay, so that's another time. Okay, I gotta get my watch off here just so we can get this thing going. And Dave, I think this is your water. So just a second. Why did you pour yourself water? Just to give that. Okay. Right. So I know what it says here anyway. So what have I been saying? I've been saying that I've written a book, and the book I for a long time worked as and still do as an economist, an energy economist, an analyst, a policy analyst, to say, what does society need to do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And I finally realized it doesn't matter what we're doing if we are still living with, it's a different size. Okay, let's try it. Wait. Try that one here. No, that's the original challenge, was that I'd have to control 2 devices that work, but actually that's too easy. So one of them doesn't work. So I'll let those guys deal with it. Where was I? Right, what I was saying was that we need to work more with the social scientists, with psychologists, with sociologists, to understand how humans are unable to deal with the climate problem. And that's what I've been working on more and more for at least the last decade. And as I say, some of these chapters in the book, I worked on them with my grad students 8 and 9 years ago. And so now I'm going to tell you about them, but that's why the beginning of my talk talks about human delusions. And I actually started with a couple of quotes. So I'm going to read the quotes to you. The first quote is from Upton Sinclair, who was an American politician writing and a writer writing about 100 years ago. And this quote, it's almost better not to read it, but to hear it. It's difficult to get someone to understand something when their salary depends on them not understanding it. And so you can write that 120 years ago or 100 years before that, and you can certainly understand what we're talking about now. And this is so fun. I'm finally giving live talks again. I'm so thrilled to be here, and I saw nodding heads, which is harder in the talks that I've been giving for the last year and a half. The second quote, so think of that first, not understanding. The second quote is by Bertrand Russell, a British philosopher writing about 100 years ago. And he said, what someone believes on grossly insufficient evidence is an index into their desires. So the first one was sort of like my financial self-interest. This second one is how I would like to see the world. Now, these themes are going to come out in what I'm going to describe to you right now. And the next part of my talk is really visual. So, okay. Okay. So there's your quotes. Don't clap yet. Okay, let's just wait and see. It was working before you came in as well. So, and so here's what I want to show you. The debate yourself game. Okay, so my talk is going to be a little choppier now. It just doesn't have the flow I was looking for. For 25 years, I've taught a graduate course, and I had my last class on Tuesday night, 5 hours. They're dedicated graduate students from Simon Fraser University, but also from the University of British Columbia. And we hold some of the classes in my house. And, but this is not from this year, so that's why there's no masks or anything. Throw anything at me you want. I can take it. And I'll try to do a better job of integrating it into the talk. And ta-da, these students. So what I do is I say to them, think about something related to energy that you feel strongly about. You think that we shouldn't have nuclear power, or we shouldn't build a Site C dam, or the Trans Mountain Pipeline, or we shouldn't have biofuels. Think of those statements, right? They might be, you think, yeah, that's right. I'm really against that, or I'm really. So then I say, give me the best arguments to support your position. And so they do that. And then I say, but this is going to be different. Remember in high school that some of you were on one team arguing and some on the other. So we're basically teaching you how to be lawyers, like to make the best possible argument for something. Now I want you to give the best possible argument for the opposite of what you believe. The debate yourself game. And they are terrible at it. The first time they are really terrible. And they start to realize how terrible they are. Sometimes I have to nudge them a bit. I say, come on, there's got to be better arguments than that for the Site C dam. And so and then soon they see it themselves. They say, wow, we're not really thinking like scientists. We're not really challenging ourselves. What is it that we have as humans that makes us want to defend what we believe and be selective in our evidence? And none of us are ever going to be perfect objective machines. So that's not the goal. It's to nudge ourselves to be slightly more critical, careful thinkers, self-critical. And that's what my book is about, especially the opening chapters about smoking and how we thought about that and what smokers would believe versus non-smokers, even smoking doctors, what they would believe. And so all of those kind of things roll out also with the challenge of climate change. And so that's a big thing, is to think about and challenge yourself. And what you're going to see through the rest of this talk is that I'm going to bring some of things out that I hope even may make some of you uncomfortable. But I hope you also don't just dismiss, but actually say, let me get excited about challenging myself a bit in this thinking. So, and then also though, things where you'll say, no, I am not going to look at the alternative to this, then bring it up in question period. Come after me and we'll see. Okay, so, oh good. The reason I wanted to coordinate was so I wouldn't have to keep looking back, but I think that plan is out the window. Okay, so critical thinking and the climate. What I try to also bring into the book, into this talk, is I have been around the leading scholars in the world. I'm an editor on the academic journals. I did things that at least got me a good reputation in academia. That's Dave mentioned distinguished professor. It's no big deal, but it's something Simon Fraser gives to just a few professors and the Royal Society of Canada. And so, I've had to change my mind on various things over the years through listening carefully and continuing to challenge my grad students and have them challenge me. These are very bright people. So what can I say is a good summary about this challenge of critical thinking about the climate? Well, it's going to sound really basic to some of you, but it's amazing how we lose sight of that. And that's that we have to stop open burning of fossil fuels. Now, you're like, yes, of course, stop using fossil fuels. Doesn't say that. It says stop open burning of fossil fuels. And so I hope that troubles some of you a little bit. we'll come back to it. And so what I'm going to run through right now are, I know what I'm going to do. Anyway, no, I'll keep pressing here. I got it. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about 4 key challenges to decarbonization. And I'm going to call them myths. The first is the myth that fossil fuels are expensive. But so haven't you heard that? Like renewables are getting cheaper than fossil fuels are expensive. So they're not. Fossil fuels are incredibly cheap. And the reason, as my students know, is because they have great quality. We call it exergy. You can't match it. You can take a thimbleful of gasoline is enough energy to lift a car to the top of the Eiffel Tower. They're amazing. And well, we're running out of them. And Dave mentioned, I guess I talked about peak oil at that time. So there's a chapter in the book called We're Running Out of Fossil Fuel, or fossil fuels will get too expensive anyway, because we're running out. But in fact, the Earth's crust is chock-a-block full. And that's probably the graph I did that goes on and on. It's all the ways in which you could make gasoline. And it's about 10,000 times the amount of our annual production is embedded in fossil fuels. And they get cheaper. We're innovating all the time. People would say to me, oh, well, we're innovating with renewables. Look how the cost of wind and solar is falling. And I'd say, what is the cost of fracking natural gas? How fast is that falling? Because that fell at a tremendous rate. And people are saying, well, but then we're going to stop using fossil fuels. Well, what do you think happens to their price when we stop using as we use less fossil fuels? It means the price starts to fall because there's all the same producers competing for a smaller market. So the ones who are lower cost of production compete and lower their price, and the higher cost producers, Alberta Oil Sands, hint, hint, they get forced out of the market. They're going to be pushed right out. And so they still offer the cheapest development path. I'll give you one more anecdote since I'm freewheeling now anyway. I got up at 3:30 this morning because I was for 2 days in a conference organized. It was in Harvard, but I didn't fly there, but it actually was in New Delhi. And it was about how could India, with a system of government like Canadian one, a federal system, so a national government, but state or province governments. And I was there to talk about our Canadian federal system. How could India fulfill its COP26 promise? What are all that entails with that? And again, I've had so many people say to me, oh, wind is the cheapest. You should look at the numbers we were just looking at for India for making more electricity. Coal was free. Like it's basically free. And we kind of ended it with them saying, okay, so as long as we get the $1 trillion that was promised to us in Glasgow, sure, we won't build coal plants. Now, I don't want you to be, there's a transition going on in India that's really exciting, and I can talk about that later on. So don't take it in a totally pessimistic sense. But that development path, here's an example. I mean, most people are aware of this. In fact, the fossil fuel industry loves to say to us, well, there's no point doing anything here because they're building another coal plant in China. They're not actually building any more coal plants in China. Almost none, and they're closing ones faster. But in a 25-year period, or 35-year period, look at how China's emissions shot up as they also had incredible economic development. That's a development path that improved the lives significantly of about 3, 4, even 500 million people over a 35-year period. And so what do we tell India? What do we tell Southeast Asia? What do we tell Africa? So that's the first myth, that fossil fuels are cheap. The second is the myth of a voluntary global agreement. So we're going to have some kind of binding international agreement because we can't guarantee that the United States will never again elect a Donald Trump, but even a George Bush, who pulled them out of the Kyoto Agreement. So it doesn't have to be the most horrendous Republican, or that Brazil will never have another Bolsonaro, or Russia another Putin, or India another Modi. Although I've learned some interesting things about him this morning and yesterday, in terms of India actually trying to launch forward with some really good things about climate. But we don't have a global government. Rich and poor countries disagree on the sharing of costs. I told you about the $1 trillion. And yet our negotiations every year are based on this idea that we can get a voluntary treaty. And so that's why at Glasgow, people talked about the national commitment. But remember, a national commitment that people agree to at Glasgow doesn't mean the country will still try to do that 3 years later after the next election and there's a new government in power. So we have to be thinking about how to make, how to have a binding agreement. So how compliance mechanisms, and I'll talk more about that later. So at COP26, as I said, focus on commitments, but no mechanism. Okay, the third, the myth of sincere domestic policy debate. And this is, so I'm going to make this distinction between climate sincere and climate insincere politicians. And if we have time in question period, I'd even like to talk about your choices in your federal riding here in the last election. And so we might have some fun with that. But so the first thing is that financial self-interest motivates corporations and individuals to trumpet the benefits of continued fossil fuel use, right? That we got to build this, we got to do that. And that's hard for a climate sincere politician because they're elected by all Canadians or all British Columbians. And so people are interested in economic development, in jobs, and in being able to have a decent standard of living. Also, the climate sincere politician is challenged by the climate insincere politicians who will set these distant targets. They'll say, oh, sure, I won't be around. So I'll tell you what, I'm promising net zero in 2050. Now, someone can say net zero in 2050 and be sincere and implement policies that will prove that to me. And I would try to communicate them to you, but that's what I'm going to try to do here. But it's also easy for an insincere politician, right? Because it takes time to transition our energy system. And so they can be legitimate, or it seem legitimate. And then finally, we find that insincere politicians can actually lie about the economic harm from effective policies. And Dave mentioned me and carbon pricing. I'm not solely an advocate of carbon pricing. You're going to see in the next slides that it could be carbon pricing, could be other things, but there's ways to tell if someone's not implementing either carbon pricing or some kind of regulation. So they can climate insincere politicians can lie about economic harm and get away with it. Stephen Harper can defeat Stéphane Dion. The fourth and final is the myth that decarbonization is complicated. Now, I was listening to CBC radio this morning and yesterday morning. I guess it was The Current, or is that what it's called? Yeah. And oh, he's such a good, I've forgotten his name. Matt Galloway. Yeah, he's fantastic. But all they were doing was what you could do about climate. And just listening, I had to turn it off because they're trying to do something good. I remember shows like this 25 years ago, but they also make it sound awfully complicated because everybody's got their thing that you ought to do to save the climate. You know, you should plant this kind of plant, or you should walk this way down the street, or I don't, oh, there we go. Right, so here's a typical quote. Fossil fuels are so integrated into our lives that phasing them out would require us to change everything about how and where we live, how we get around, and how we make money. So isn't that true? Or doesn't that sound familiar to some of you? I found that quote, I was like, oh, I'm near the end of the book. I better go get a quote like that, and got one right away. I can find these I hear this all the time. And so my message here tonight and in the book is it's actually very simple. So go back to that first thing I said, which was we have to stop burning fossil fuels. Stick with that. So this is what we call, some of the scholars, and the complexity assumption. And the argument is that it's paralyzing as everyone adds on their pet solution. Their pet solution may be a really good thing to do, and it may be a really good thing to talk your fellow citizens into doing. But someone like me who's answering questions when people say, what is really what we should focus on strategically, then I have to say to you, simplify it. And so the path is actually simple, and I'm going to have a few slides now, just 2 points to make that. The first is about the actions. So I'm going to talk, there's a number 1 and there's a number 2. Number 2 is the policies. The actions are the things you do. Like maybe you don't burn gasoline anymore in your travels. You don't burn natural gas in your residence. The policy is the thing that makes it more interesting for you to do that. It's either a regulation that's banning gasoline cars, or it's a carbon tax that's making it more expensive to burn natural gas relative to electric heat. So what are the key actions? Again, rapidly phase out the burning of coal, oil, and most uses of natural gas. But you notice again, I'm saying burning because you might be able to use fossil fuels for other things. And what are the key sectors? Electricity and transportation. Now, why do I say that? First, we already have technologies. The experts will agree we're set. Of course, we'll have more innovation in how to make electricity. We'll do better with batteries probably, and also in transportation, especially in large and heavy vehicles. But we have biofuels, we have electric vehicles, and batteries, we have hydrogen and fuel cells, and we know what these cost. And of course, the cost will change. But the other thing is that those sectors, the fact that this is a global problem is challenging when we're dealing with, let's say, a steel plant. Because the steel plant in Ontario, if we say to them, get to zero emissions, well, fossil fuels are great. It's the cheapest way to make steel. They're going to lose out in competing with steel plants from jurisdictions, from countries that are laggards on climate policy. So this has been a break on what we do with large industry around the world, the fact that we don't have a global compliance agreement. Remember my second challenge. So we call those domestic sectors, unlike the trade exposed steel, cement, aluminum. If we change our electricity costs, it affects our industry a little bit, but not that much. And likewise with our transportation, it's really a kind of a domestic thing. And that's where we've made the most progress. And I have some good news here, because electricity and transportation, which we know how to do it, and it's relatively cheap, it really won't lead to higher costs of industry or even just typical families. And yet if we do that, we're going to actually solve more than half of the energy component, which is the easiest to solve, of the global climate problem. Now, I'll just explain this slide, so bear with me. The OECD stands for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Think of that as a shorthand acronym for the wealthier countries. So non-OECD are the poorer countries. China's included in there, and there's lots of countries that are, between both worlds. So this is an oversimplification. The size of those pies indicate our forecasts of how much emissions will be produced in those different blocks of countries by the year 2050. So those are annual emissions. I think I have the numbers, about 45 gigatons of carbon. That's the 45 GT. What I was just talking to you about, though, was transportation and electricity. And you can see that if we succeed in decarbonizing even those two sectors, we will do more than half of getting our emissions down. And we now have about 23 countries whose greenhouse gas emissions are going down. Some are like Canada, where they've been flat, where closing coal plants in Ontario and other innovations related to BC's carbon tax have been offset by growth in the oil sands. And now our forecasts show it like this, and even heading down like other wealthier countries. But we need this to happen planet-wise. But that's the good news here. Now, the second thing is what I was just talking about, the policies. So remember, actions. So stop burning coal, oil, and gas, electricity and transportation first, but everywhere else too. And buildings, very important. And that's also a domestic sector. I just didn't put buildings in there because it's much smaller. So there's those actions. I'll call them decarbonization actions. You may have heard that term. And those policies have to be compulsory. So Dave, when you said, carbon tax, good, I probably said carbon tax or regulations. But you got a good message from that. So this little tree is actually quite simple. And so let's just take a look at it here. What I'm trying to do is work from the top down. These are the only policies. So every possible policy is in these categories. This is important because when politicians love to have long lists, and those long lists, then they can tick them off. I did this, I did that, I did this. People like me who are outside independent experts are always trying to boil down their lists and say, no, 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 you just lumped together a whole bunch of stuff that does almost nothing. Let's just find the real stuff. So the non-compulsory stuff, information, labels, some subsidies, government saying we're going to clean up our own buildings or our vehicle fleets. The information might be Rick Mercer commercials. In fact, that was our biggest thrust after the Kyoto Agreement, was the Chrétien government said, we're going to do the 1-ton challenge with Rick Mercer. I actually was involved with people who did surveys of Canadians who had all said, yeah, I saw it. Okay, and so what did you think you knew what to do afterwards? And no one, no, it was like 99.78% had no idea what to do after watching Rick Mercer, but they loved the commercials. So my point is not that you don't do the non-compulsory stuff. Sometimes we need that. Government building transit, labels on vehicles. Those things can be really important, but they have to be part of the compulsory policies. And there's only two kinds of compulsory: regulations and carbon pricing. And then even carbon pricing, you can split in two. A cap and trade, you put a cap on emissions, you give out permits that add up to that. And then the amount of permits go down every year. And so people trade the permits. And if some can reduce their emissions cheaply, they'll do that because they'll have surplus permits to sell to people who need them because it was expensive to get down there. And that trading price is the same as a carbon tax. So it'll have the same effect on the price of gasoline as a carbon tax. So I don't even want to spend time, but Quebec right now has cap and trade. It's joined with the California cap and trade. British Columbia has a carbon tax. And now Rachel Notley had a carbon tax in Alberta, but then Jason Kenney got rid of it. But then the federal government came along and said, we're going to have a carbon tax right across the land. And so it won't apply in British Columbia because you got your own, but it'll apply in Saskatchewan or any other province that doesn't have its own policy. And this is what I was explaining at 4:15 this morning, was how that backstop policy at the federal level worked in Canada. And people were, the Indians were very interested in this. And then we have regulations. And normally in this talk, I spend some time explaining, people say, well, regulations, they're all regulations. We are now making regulations that are quite flexible. And so in British Columbia, I've been involved in the latest work on a new climate policy that came out on October 25th. And so did a press conference on that. And in that one, we have a ZEV mandate in British Columbia, zero emission vehicles. So we're telling vehicle sellers, I'm sorry, you can only sell these vehicles. Maybe you'll have to jack up the price on a Porsche, a gasoline guzzling, one of these $70,000, $80,000 cars, so that you can get the price of electric vehicles lower, so that more middle-class people can buy those, or people who are working, who buy it together. And so those kind of regulations are quite interesting. And in BC, we have a lot of them. Now, what I'm going to show here, here's my sum up. So this relates to our comment. You must have carbon pricing and or regulations. Okay, so now, remember, later on, people ask, how am I supposed to figure out whether someone's climate sincere or not? I'm about to elect. Have they explained that they're going to have carbon pricing or regulations? So keep that one down. There's information note right away. But then notice the and or. So you don't have to do carbon pricing. You don't have to do regulations. You got to do one or the other or a combination. And in BC, we have a combination. And I'm not even going to go into this stuff, but I'll show you these. Here's a couple. Oh yeah, okay. I'll just put these up here. So in British Columbia, when Gordon Campbell was the premier, we were in 2006, 2007, BC Hydro had signed memorandum of understanding to build 2 coal plants, one up at Taylor and one in Princeton. And I and lots of environmentalists were doing demonstrations and so on. And then crazily, and I tried to help. First of all, Joyce Murray had been the Minister of Environment. She's a good friend of mine. I was helping her develop a clean electricity standard. And then she was not elected in 2005. And when this really became a hot issue, 2006, 2007, finally, with lots of pressure from everyone, Gordon Campbell got me to help design a clean electricity standard, which said BC Hydro couldn't buy electricity from any fossil fuel burning plant. It could with natural gas if the natural gas was also being used to heat already. So you're capturing some electricity where you're already burning natural gas at a hospital, at a university, and so on. But basically, and the 2 coal projects had to be folded up. So that's a clean electricity standard. And we've had, like, all the Democratic states in the United States have something like that. And right now the Biden administration is trying to design that. And right now in Canada, at the federal level, we have that. Phasing out all coal plants by 2030, and they're going to make it even tighter. The Liberals committed to that, and I know they're working on that very hard. The zero emission vehicle standard, it started in California. It says, I've already described it. Quebec was the first adopter in Canada. BC adopted, and on October 25th, we announced that instead of by 2030, it was going to be 30% of vehicles in BC sold had to be zero emission. Now it's by 2030, 90% have to be zero emission. So we are on a rapid path to zero emission vehicles. And it's going to be tricky though. So we can talk about it in question, but the industry is going to have to do some of that price. It's going to charge a higher price on the expensive cars and get the price down. And that kind of policy means that they're also going to have to advertise like crazy electric vehicles. Wouldn't it be nice to watch a Canucks game and not have to see photos of hip-looking people driving around destroying the planet, but looking like they're part of nature? Yeah, right. Well, so that was a long fight to get that through. And I just want to show you California, which is the fastest, was the fastest moving in North America. BC is going to get close, and Quebec, and maybe all of Canada with the policies that we've got and are putting in right now. But look at this, the flexible regulations are all the yellow. The size of this pie simply depicts how much of the greenhouse gas reductions between 2010, when Arnold Schwarzenegger put in the policies, and then the 2025. So it's historical plus future. It was what California was aiming for. That's the size of the pie. And the point I'm just making here is that cap and trade, as I said, is carbon pricing. Most of it's coming from regulations. It doesn't matter though. It really doesn't matter. That's another area where don't have a strong position one way or the other. Okay. So here we go. Those were the actions, right? Stop burning, do something else. The policies that a sincere politician has to be putting in. So here, how can we sum that part up? Well, for 3 decades, experts have been telling us a coordinated global effort won't happen voluntarily. I'll get back to that later. Electricity and transportation are achievable and globally critical. Renewables won't replace fossil fuels without carbon pricing or regs, remember, or regs. And we can use flex, and the reason there is because fossil fuels are cheap and they're going to get cheaper. And we can use flex regs if we want to. So when Stéphane Dion was running and wanted to run on a carbon tax, and did come to Vancouver to talk to me about it, and I advised him against it. But he said, no, Canadians will go with this. I mean, I really love Stéphane Dion, and some of you are old enough to remember. Very courageous, very honest, fantastic integrity. But he got slaughtered by Stephen Harper, who just gave us a lot of lies about the carbon tax, to be honest, about its economic harm, how punitive it was, and so on. So if we know all these things, what's blocking us from the simple path to decarbonization. So this is the last third of my talk. So I am on time to our, so the first is deliberate delusions. So now I'm taking you back to the very first slides. And this is the one where I don't have to take much time on this. You've all heard this. Even the younger ones would have heard enough of this. We also went through this period when a whole bunch of pipelines might get built, right? There was like the Northern Gateway and so on, and just inundated with advertising telling us, some of it telling us, so op-eds, that the climate science is uncertain, or this next fossil fuel project is essential because it's going to provide the money for our schools and our healthcare and so on and so forth. So maybe you guys are not as sensitized to that as me, but I saw all of that over and over again. Or we have to wait for innovations, right? The point of the earlier part of my talk is no, we have the technologies, and especially in these sectors. And then the other one is no point acting until there's a binding global agreement, which is a great way to all go to hell together, right? So now back here though, rigid pro and con views. Now I'm going to point out a few, like nuclear power, large hydropower, biofuels, carbon capture and storage with fossil fuels. So what am I saying? Am I arguing for nuclear power? Nope. But there could be places on this planet where we will still use nuclear power. Right now, Ontario is looking very seriously at where it has a nuclear plant that's getting old, refurbishing it and continuing to operate it. And even the Germans have had some thinking about that as well. China, part of its off coal is to build nuclear plants. I don't like nuclear power. We're not even sure what to do with the waste yet. So this is pretty crazy to go big on nuclear power. But I'm not going to be someone who says no anywhere. And in fact, I'm also not going to be someone who says you absolutely have to have nuclear power. I once toured the European capitals with James Hansen, the former NASA scientist who was a big name as one of the earliest scientists talking about climate change. And when he and I were touring to try to talk, because of his famous name, we were able to visit the European leaders. So in Germany, France, England, The Hague, and then we spoke before the European Parliament. And he told every leader, you have to have nuclear power. And I was like, James, like, it's not certain you have to have nuclear power, but this is what he believed. So even thinking that a lot of you will be like, we shouldn't have nuclear power, there are also people who really believe we have to have nuclear power. And I push back on that too, because we've got all sorts of scenarios where we can get to zero emissions without nuclear power. Large hydropower. I think in British Columbia, we should not be building large hydro projects anymore. And I felt that before the Site C Dam, and am public for that. But Manitoba, with some agreement with First Nations, as I understand it, is building a hydro project in the north there. And we have, even when Quebec did its James Bay project, that was all in agreements with the Cree who were there and who saw it as part of their economic development. So I don't know. I'm just saying I want to be really careful not to feel like I know it all, that I know for sure the exact right answer. It's just not that simple. Likewise, biofuels. People will say, well, we can't use biofuels. And I'll say, well, the Brazilians have taken some land, and some of that land is where they're producing sugarcane and they're making biofuels from it. And here's the record of how much less CO2 from fossil fuels that the Brazilians put into the atmosphere over the last 40 years with their biofuel program. And they didn't lose very much biodiversity at all. It's like, it's 1/1000th, no, it's less than that, of the land mass of Brazil. And then also, so we have big campaigns to say we must stop using fossil fuels. Well, imagine going to Alberta and saying that to people and then saying to them, and I want you to help elect a government so that we're all going to work together on climate. Well, usually the human mind doesn't work that way. And the fossil fuel industry, though, they love this kind of rigidity, right? Because it keeps everybody stuck. But we can't afford to let perfection be the enemy of good. So possibly when I was speaking 15 years ago, I was probably referring to a book I published then called Sustainable Fossil Fuels. No, that's not me on the bike. But one of my students, one of my grad students won a really good bottle of scotch because I had had a competition. Who could find me a good cover for that book? But I wrote that book because, first of all, I knew there was tons of fossil fuels. Secondly, I was working frequently with the Chinese government and with some international experts. The landmass is full of coal, trying to figure out how to help them still use that cheap coal, but bury the CO2. So it's the emissions we care about, right? Not the use of fossil fuels per se. I mean, you want to make sure, sometimes we use fossil fuels with lots of local pollutants as well. And so there are big reasons and challenges there, but there's also sometimes you can use it actually quite cleanly if you regulate properly. And we have challenges with every one of our options. But why did I write that book? Well, one of the reasons was that I just was the people who said we must have renewables. What they told people in regions where they were well endowed with fossil fuels, whether it's Saudi Arabia or Alberta or Texas, is we were telling them, we have to annihilate your economy in order to save the planet. And they didn't believe us, and nor should they. But what it meant was, well, think of that first quote from Upton Sinclair. They were very motivated not to believe the science, and that's what the polls show, very motivated to use government taxpayer money to subsidize the fossil fuel industry, and so on and so forth. So I just ask, think about being strategic about how people think. So it's not like we're trying to trick them, but we might say, look, we got to get to zero emissions. Doesn't mean that the production of oil and gas necessarily plummets tomorrow, but the emissions have to plummet tomorrow. And we talk about that more in question period if you want. But that's the idea of starting to think, I'm going to argue, starting to think in a more mature way about how we can work as individuals and groups to nudge our society to accelerate a bit. And that's going to mean giving and taking. It's going to mean thinking a little bit sophisticated and not just having simple knee-jerk reactions. This is good, this is bad. I'm going to have a rigid position on that, even though I know I can't bring along enough of my other citizens in a democracy. So it isn't just what me and the people that are around me feel. It's how do we get elected into power to put in the small incremental changes and make the compromises, but that accelerate us on the right path. The third is agenda-hitching biases. So this is a little bit of what I'm just talking about already. So I'll move on from this because I want to get finished and have some fun in question. But you could have people arguing we have to abolish capitalism. Well, I mean, there's a whole bunch of negative things about capitalism, believe me. I don't have to convince most people here, I'm sure. Global capitalism, but it's also its regional effects. And yet the question is, why do so many of your fellow Canadians vote for parties that do believe in private markets having a significant part of the economy and in private property? So it's about 70% of Canadians keep voting for liberals and conservatives. And so that's what your fellow citizens believe. So even if you're a socialist, I say you have to be thinking about how you can move people on this path and what compromises you might have to make. But a lot of these things, so this was CBC for the last 2 days. And I support the benefits of a lot of these things. But we have to be careful because what they do is they confuse and paralyze to some extent too. So pursue those things, but maybe don't always tell us that they're the solution to climate change. Well, I've had people say it's buildings, it's dry, and then they add up, and the stuff adds up to the total. Remember my pie charts? It's like 6 pie charts because everybody tries to bias the numbers to say the thing I want, stop eating meat, that's the thing that's really going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So the experts I work with can't make any of this stuff add up. And again, though, the fossil fuel industry loves that. And then the last thing is we have to be able to identify climate insincere politicians, as I mentioned. Now, sometimes you get lucky and they pose for a photo together. But what if they're a bit smarter than that? What if they actually, kind of hide in the weeds a little bit? And so you have to be able to detect them. And so how are we going to do that? Well, I used to have a slide that said, here are all the things that they'll tell you they're not true, but you've already even heard some of that already when I was describing Stéphane Dion versus Stephen Harper. So instead, what I'm going to do in this slide is just tell you what is a climate sincere politician. And now you should almost be able to do this yourself. They speak honestly about the necessity of pricing and or regulations. And they implement these policies quickly, especially in electricity and transportation. But then notice I say also buildings, light industry, land use, because those are also not exposed to trade from laggard countries. For those trade exposed industries, they also do some pricing and regs. And I won't go into the detail because it even takes me 20 minutes to go through it with my graduate students. And so we don't, you're as smart as they are, but we don't have the time. So you have some kind of pricing. But you don't increase their cost of production as if they paid on every ton from a steel mill or from a cement plant or an aluminum plant. But so governments also have to give them some money to drive innovation. But if you charge them for all their pollution, they'll just go out of business. and they will. I mean, they'd have to. You would, if you owned that steel plant, you would just not be able to make ends meet if you paid the full price for that carbon, and your competitors, many of your competitors around the world, almost all, except the European ones, are not paying a price on carbon. So in the last federal election, in your riding, I heard Abby Lewis on CBC radio say, we're going to make industry pay. No more loopholes for industry. They're going to pay the full carbon price. And that's a real problem. To me, that's not sincere. He's a very sincere person, but I'm saying that giving you that message is not sincere. So what do we have to do? We have to start getting to those global agreements. And those global agreements, there are people working on this right now. In fact, later this week, Catherine McKenna is a speaker on a talk that my students are all going to listen to, and there's other people on there about what's called border carbon adjustments. Don't worry about the jargon. It just means carbon tariffs, that if China or the Americans want to import something into Canada, we have to look at what was the rough carbon content in their electricity system or their steel plant that went into that product. And there's experts around the world who've worked out ways to be able to help people with that. And this is something that in Glasgow was discussed significantly, but actually it's happening outside of the COP process, the Congress of the Parties. It's happening among smaller groups of countries. I'm really looking forward to seeing if the Europeans and the Americans and the Canadians come forward in the next few years or something like that. There's a lot of talk, so it won't be the whole world. It'll be a few countries starting the process, but powerful enough. And then, of course, in the energy transition, we need a government that supports the workers who are displaced. It'll actually be, a lot of it's more gradual than you might think. It's not as horrendous. Helping Indigenous peoples, though, decarbonize where they live and get economic self-determination through control of the land and control of the value they can get from that land. Also helping low-income households and so on. So what about our Canadian government? Well, now, and I'm fine to do this in this talk. I'm going to sound like I'm a federal liberal partisan, but you should have heard me talking about Jean Chrétien. I wrote op-eds and major studies and reports explaining that the liberal federal government was doing nothing, and then the Harper conservative government was doing nothing. But in 2015, it changed dramatically federally in Canada, and that's just the truth. And the evidence there, I'm amazed how poorly the media and experts like me, I've been trying, can't get that message out. So I'm trying to do it right now. They have focused on carbon pricing. So Canada now has a national carbon tax. That wouldn't happen if Stephen Harper had won the 2015 election. And we have those intensified regulations. And I'll just give you some examples as we go down. We are also working on a global effort. And we're trying to support impacted regions and groups. Now I'll give you some specifics. The coal plant phase out. So Stephen Harper had put in a coal plant phase out that meant that as long as the coal plant lasted, the coal plant wouldn't shut down, which seems kind of tautological. And so some of the coal plants would have lasted to 2045 or longer, because it was like, what was their natural rate? The Liberals came along and in 2016 or so changed the pollution reg and said the coal plants have to shut down, the open burning coal plants that capture the carbon and bury it, they could keep operating by 2030. And then now in this latest election, they've said, no. So we notice Alberta's replacing some coal plants with natural gas. Saskatchewan might do the same. So what we're going to do is we're going to put in a new regulation, working very hard on now. We have a new federal environment minister. So we're going to get to zero emission electricity. We're already very close. We're one of the leaders in the world because of all the hydro we built way back when. The economy-wide carbon price, I couldn't believe it when 1 year ago in December, the federal Liberals, even knowing an election would come up, they didn't know election would come up this year. But knowing that they would be going to an election at some point, well, they were already a minority government, right? So if you're a minority government, I mean, I've advised politicians, if you're in a minority government, you assume you'll have an election within 2 years. Now, they triggered it themselves, but you have to think that way. And yet they came out with a rising carbon price. Like, how do you explain that? That doesn't get you any votes, I promise you. And they also did carbon pricing for trade exposed industry, methane regs. There's a lot of other stuff that I'm not going to go through. Something called another flex reg about the carbon intensity of fuels, the ZEV mandate that I mentioned. Now we're going to have a federal one, as I said. And now they've said an oil and gas emissions cap. That's going to be really tricky to do. The last part of the semester, my grad students and I have been working on the design of one and then interacting with people federally. We realize we need a bevy of lawyers, and I can explain that if you want to ask. It's tricky. So what's my summary? Climate concerned citizens must follow a simple strategy. I'm not telling you, this is me arguing what I think you should do. You have to work to elect climate sincere politicians, and that may even involve strategic voting, because in our electoral system, you don't just get what you want to make sure you don't get what you don't want. That's sometimes the best you can do in the parliamentary British first past the post or plurality system. Push them to implement flex regs or carbon pricing, push them to make global alliances for phase outs of coal and carbon tariffs, and then take personal actions. And the big ones are cars and trucks and of course, the building in which we live. Or as I noticed walking around Whistler today, or the outside of those buildings where we burn all this natural gas to sort of stay warm or doubly heat the planet, like we heat it and heat it. And you know, I grew up in Vancouver. I was skiing at Whistler when I was 16 years old, and we had a few places, you know, restaurants and so on. Well, not even then, but eventually, and they didn't have these things outside. And my family's from Switzerland, and I even did my PhD in Grenoble so I could be near them. And I've been in Swiss villages I haven't been in any of them in the last few years, but I know that people didn't die by sitting outside for a little bit without helping to destroy the planet. But how do we get climate sincere politicians? So I've got about three or 4 minutes left. So just so you all know, now my students, some of them are engineers. And so they said, oh, Mark, you need a chart, a decision chart. So it's in the book and you start there. And so we're trying to figure out how to get the right politician in place. So do go and reference it. And by the way, I don't make money from the book. It's unfortunately free. I don't know what I was drinking when I agreed to that, but so you can go to Cambridge University Press and it's free online. So you'll be able to find it quite easily. But if you really like it, you could buy a Christmas gift for someone. And so does the politician seem sincere? Well, it's hard to know. They'll all promise you a lot of stuff, right? And so no, then you can go right down to here. We'll get down there later. Yes, so do they have greenhouse gas targets? Now remember, they can be faking it with greenhouse gas targets though. So they better also have, they better be linked to policies. But the policies could be Rick Mercer commercials. So they better be pricing and regulation. and Rick Mercer commercials, because we should have fun while we're pricing and regulating. And are those things increasing in stringency? See how the federal liberals have now said, we're going all the way up to 170 by 2030. That's another 40 cents a liter of gasoline in just 8 years from now. That's going to really help move us to electric vehicles. And in British Columbia, our October 25th press conference, we said British Columbia will meet or exceed federal carbon pricing, assuming that it's on the 170 path. So if conservatives get elected federally, BC is still on the 170 path to meet or exceed. And so then if so, you've got to campaign for, fund that politician, and even vote strategically to prevent the climate insincere. And if it's the other way around though, what do you do? Like when you're really stuck? Well, then we are going to have to be quite active. And I know I'll bet you there's people here who are quite active. And of course, then you get in one of these loops where you just have to keep doing that. You don't give up. You don't, yeah, exactly. And so that's where though, when we're stuck with climate insincere politicians, we have some really difficult moral choices to make. And there's a shot of me. I'm lucky, I'm privileged when it comes to the climate emergency because that's my area of expertise. So this is me appearing before the US Congress opposing the Keystone Pipeline and giving testimony. And, I get to look like I'm maybe even a corporate executive or something, and society listens to me. But when we have a period like we did when Stephen Harper was in power, then Chris Clark was in power and she was trying to undermine a lot of climate policies that Gordon Campbell had put in. So same political party, but different sincerity. It was a really tough time. And there was a lot of us, some of them my former students, we have to be more active. We have to think about anything, even civil disobedience. And I'm not here inviting you into civil disobedience, but that's a choice that some of us do have to make. And I think of a quote from Bill McKibben, who says, "Planet Earth is miles outside its comfort zone. How many of us will go beyond ours?" It's not me that's causing that flash. Come on, I'm almost done. Don't do anything else to me. So that's why in 2000, and so Harper got elected he had a majority in 2011. And that's when he really went crazy on expanding oil sands. Canada is an energy superpower, energy being code word for fossil fuels. And so that's when I got active as well. It was a very difficult decision. You risk your house when you do this, but I and 13 others blocked coal trains for a whole day, which the industry made sure we understood was millions of dollars. And that's me in handcuffs on my way into the paddy wagon. So fortunately, the police officer has just said to me, "I agree with you." And so that's probably why I'm smiling. I'm not smiling to go to jail. But I just put that up there, not to sort of say that I'm saying it is not easy. It is not easy to know what is the right thing. I did read a lot of Václav Havel and Gandhi and others. I'm not trying to make grandiosity of it, but I'm trying to say all of us have those choices in our life. And in the climate emergency, which is what this talk is all about, we have to think about the whole range of what is the right thing. What will the future generations feel that we should have been doing at that moment in history? And that's why I did that. And I would do it again, but it's why I also did not go with friends who wanted me to get arrested to stop the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Because I said, wrong government. I said, I think they're building that pipeline so that a battle over Canadian unity will not prevent us from doing climate change. Because I remember the Quebec battle over unity when all the climate work, this is around 92 to 94, the second Quebec referendum, nothing happened with climate. All the oxygen, political oxygen of the country was focused on unity. So I don't even care if we build an oil pipeline. It doesn't matter. You can convert it one day. But if I could keep Albertans, for the same reason I wrote that book, to not take that bias that I saw with Upton Sinclair and thinking, and not take it too strong, then that would be better so that we could implement the policies that the federal liberals implemented and are implementing. So I end with this slide. You know, we all ask, well, what can we do as an individual? Well, there's an individual, and she says, no one's too small to make a difference. And there she is again. And that's just so inspiring to me. And as Margaret Mead apparently said, no doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. And indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. So those who have the privilege to know, like you and me, have that duty to act. And so I'll end there. Thank you very much for your attention. So you're gonna.
Thank you, Mark.
Yep, go ahead.
We need to set up our chairs. I have a chair here, so we have
I'll
to
help
stay
you.
6 feet away from each other.
Okay, and for now. Can we just take these?
Yeah, I know. They're supposed to be one back of house. Let's use those.
I've had to do everything else in this. Okay, you want to? Oh,
I'm
right.
easy. That was wonderful. Thank you for actually your skills in dealing with technical difficulties. I think the ability to kind of deal with that was impressive. I have a couple questions, but before we do that, I want to actually just let people know that we are going to be using Slido. So as a reminder to all of you, if you log on to slido.com or sli.do and put in 252469, you can ask your question. You can also upvote other people's questions. So if there are questions that you'd really like to hear our Mark answer, then please do vote those up. I was fascinated by your picture from the McLean's cover. And actually, why don't we move over? You're wise to say that I shouldn't be sitting in the.
Well, you're gonna have to move a long ways.
There we go. Actually, yeah, we're not going to make that, are we?
No.
Okay, let's sit here at this table. How about that? And so and it occurred to me that those are not insincere politicians. In fact, they are very clearly who they are, and they have been clear that they do not think that pricing carbon is the right path. And so I just wonder, attaching insincerity to those people seems like maybe misses their position and what they'd say about themselves.
Yeah, no, my term is not sincerity. My term was climate sincerity.
Yeah.
Those individuals are not climate sincere. They have higher other priorities. And Stephen Harper, for example, would do you know the debate yourself game? I once played Stephen Harper against my students, and they said I was really scary because I said, look, there's a rational argument for not doing anything about the climate. What you can make up, I can make up a whole bunch, but one would be Canada's too small to make a difference. And so why should we encourage all those costs? Instead, we'll become global technological leaders and very wealthy. And then when the whole planet comes around and starts to work, we'll be well positioned to be a leading country, even in decarbonization. And that is part of his shtick. So he is not climate sincere in the sense of we have a responsibility. Now I'm a political leader in my jurisdiction where I have responsibility. I should be implementing policies to reduce greenhouse gases.
Sure.
That's and I gave you the definition of climate sincere.
Yeah.
It was, do they do this, this, and that?
Yeah. So it doesn't seem to be attached to a political party for you at all. It is very much based on what you see happening within the people, and it could be attached to any political party.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, and that's been my job. So that's why I've been an academic who's applied. I need to try to help people understand, make choices, political choices when you're voting. And so the NDP in British Columbia back in the 90s had policy statements saying we will put in a carbon tax if we get into power. Gordon Campbell implemented a carbon tax, and then the NDP started an Axe the Tax campaign. So I was writing op-eds in the Vancouver Sun all the time, analyzing any of the NDP. So I was an enemy of the NDP. With the Horgan government, I've been a friend of the NDP because they've been implementing amazing policies. And that's why it was in the federal election, the federal NDP they didn't talk about carbon. I mean, they had a carbon price in there, but they wouldn't tell us exactly what stringency and when. They did that later on in the campaign, but initially they wouldn't. And so I did a report card that came out and was used a lot about the different parties, and I was hard on the federal NDP. That's why it was kind of fun when we did our press conference here on October 25th, that there I am arm in arm with an NDP political premier. And so obviously not partisan. Yeah.
I was interested in that grading that you gave, because it occurred to me that you were grading purely on climate sincerity. It wasn't whether the plan would deliver, it was on whether you felt it was deliverable.
No. Sorry. We took what they had been telling us,
yeah,
and we spent the whole summer, well, a very talented graduate student named Emma Stark spent the summer with other people looking over her shoulder, leading policy analysts, to simulate all the different policies. Now, we'd already done the conservative one because in April, they had actually said, we're going to do a carbon price. And some of you might vaguely remember some of it from the federal campaign. So ours was, we will look at, so the NDP had a target. So one of the worst things you would do is to vote for people because who had the biggest target, right? Then you encourage them. So the Greens said 60% reduction by 2050. That's 8 years from now. The NDP said 50%, the Liberals said 40%, and the Conservatives said 30%. That would be the wrong way to rank sincerity. Sincerity would be, did their policies achieve their target? Their stated clear policies. So we simulated in this very large model that's well known across the country, and it gives about the same results as the one the federal government does and the Trottier Institute in Montreal. And so we simulated that, and it showed, and we also said, are you being honest about the economic costs of that? So the NDP, in my view, were incredibly dishonest about the cost to the economy. So this is the federal NDP. It's nothing to me, it's never an attack on the NDP. It happens to be the federal NDP heading into this federal election. The provincial NDP is like a climate leader in North America. So that's how we came to it, is look at your policy, look at your target, look at your policy. Were you honest about, did you state policies at stringencies that would achieve it? So you go right off of that chart I had.
And is there any component that attaches whether their targets tie into the IPCC targets, or is it just believable for here?
You can't tie it to the IPCC. Now, can you think about that? Like, so to tie, there is no, this is the right reduction for our country to meet 1.5. And I'm really sorry to say that. It would be nice if it was a simple world, but now it really would be determined about what happens in China and India and elsewhere. And that's why I would also look to see if those parties were talking about carbon tariffs. Now, in that one, the NDP said we got to have carbon tariffs. So they didn't lose any points on that.
So one of the questions that we had was, you endorsed would you agree with the statement, you endorsed the liberal climate policy at the last election?
I rated it highest.
Okay, so the question goes on to say, what was your main concern with the Green Party's policy?
So as I recall, I rated the Greens higher than the NDP. And so I didn't have any interaction with the Green. We say that academics like me are cheap dates. And what that means is if someone wants to listen to us, a politician, they can take us to McDonald's and we'll go. And so for at least 2 elections, I have helped Elizabeth May with the green policy. And that's why early on, Elizabeth May had done stuff about, well, we'll get industry to pay. And so I tried to explain to her, actually, we have to pay. We have to reduce our emissions. It isn't these bad guys over there. In fact, the bad guy industry, we have a real conundrum to how to get their emissions down, because it's either shut down or stay up. So the Greens still had some legacy of that. They didn't talk to me in this election, but they had that. But their target of 60% in 9 years, we'll give them the benefit of the doubt that somehow you'd implement policy by now. But really, these policies have to roll out over the next 2 years. Like I was just telling you about the phalanx of lawyers to try to figure out the cap on oil and gas emissions, which is what I'm really focused on. And so for the Greens to say 60% reduction in 9 years is crazy. Like you'd have to blow up half the cars around there. Like you buy something, you buy a car, on average, they last 15 years. Some of them only last a couple of years, but on average, they last 15 years. Furnaces, same thing. So and then electricity plants, whatever. It's a 60%. We can simulate the cost of the economy, but you're not going to have money for daycare or health, all sorts of looking after the elderly. You're going to have dramatic increases in taxes, and even then not have the money to do that.
So our riding, you mentioned Patrick Weiler and Avi Lewis were the and John Weston, but you said earlier that Avi is personally sincere. I assume that you rated their policy as climate insincere, and the case that he made was someone needs to go to Ottawa and disrupt the way things are happening in Ottawa and speak to the crisis and speak to the nature of what we face. That didn't get your attention at all?
So you said, I said he's sincere. What I said is, I think he's a sincere person.
Yes.
I don't talk about sort of the person. I just rank them, and his party, and especially him describing what they would do to industry on CBC radio was, to me, the extreme of climate insincerity. And I'm not saying he's lying, but I'm saying he's telling people that we just going to hammer industry. It's their fault that you're driving a car or heating your house with natural gas, and it isn't. And so that score is really bad, even with my IPCC colleagues. Yeah.
And you didn't think someone needs to go to Ottawa and make a statement in Ottawa compelling?
So, I mean, why would he go to, he can make that statement anywhere. He wouldn't have any, I don't see how that would help.
Okay.
Yeah. So
the correct answer, Mark, is no, you didn't find it compelling.
Yeah, I didn't find it
Okay,
compelling.
there you go.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you. Yeah.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. I'll answer a couple other ones in the future. as
Yes,
well.
please do.
Yeah, there you go. Bill Rees at UBC suggests that individual efforts to reduce climate change are just silly, is the quote. The real issue is humanity's excessive consumption. Can you respond to your colleague?
Yeah, so Bill's at UBC and I'm at SFU, but I do consider him a good friend, and I love Bill Rees. And is that him sending this or someone else?
It looks like it may be him. No, it's someone in the audience.
Oh, okay.
It's one of his representatives.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so I've debated with Bill publicly on economic growth. We ended up agreeing on a lot. I use writings of Bill in my teaching. He really works on and he's an ecologist and but I mean, he's so well read in everything. He really understands the challenge for us humans on an evolutionary basis. You know, that our desire to acquire. Why does a chimpanzee acquire bright colored things, and then even sometimes they apparently trade them for sex? I don't know. We have this historical or this evolutionary legacy that he thinks may doom us. And in fact, he would, if you bet on it with him, he would put really high odds that it would doom us. And so I would argue that humans have faced lots of challenges in the past and have survived. We may not, now in the Anthropocene, when we're affecting all of the major cycles on the planet, and we don't yet have the political institutions and even maybe the mentality to solve those things, we are in big trouble.
Mhm.
But I can't write off that we can't solve that. And that's why I wrote The Citizen's Guide, was for the climate problem. And the book I'm working on right now is for total sustainability, not just CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions sustainability. The tentative title is called The Right Stuff. And what it means is we have to figure out the lessons we learn from solving CO2 needs to be applied to just about everything. And some of that's going on already. Plastics, we need to regulate the manufacturers of plastics. It isn't somebody choosing and putting this here and there, or everything you buy at the store is in some kind of plastic already. So I'm going further, but my point is that lots of what Bill says, you've got to pay attention to.
Mhm.
And is he ultimately right? He might be. But I think that you shouldn't. So then I said to Bill, I've said, so what should we do? Just go have a drink? And I mean, he has tried to do things to help us raise our awareness. So the ecological footprint that some of you might have heard of, Bill and a PhD student conceived of that. So it was a mechanism to get people to be aware of how they were affecting the planet.
Yeah.
So Bill has done that. Well, that's part of his contribution.
Thanks. We have a question here from Eddie that says, do you think Whistler, which aims to be a climate leader, should target net zero emissions by 2030, such as Ithaca, New York, and Hamilton Hills, Ontario have done?
So first of all, Ithaca, New York, and Hamilton Hills, Ontario, do they still have gasoline and diesel burning trucks going into their city? So often when people say they're net zero or something, they're only talking about electricity. And oh my goodness, I see that a lot. So I can't speak for those two communities. Well, actually, I can say with great confidence that those two communities are not zero, that they're only looking at what they want to look at. So, but can Whistler? Oh, absolutely. And the big thing will simply be vehicles. And so I have a fun anecdote because as a very nice gift for us coming here, I said, well, put us up at the Chateau Fairmont, whatever. And I said, can we, is there a place to plug in our vehicle? And so my partner and I just spent all this time driving through, and they have tons of places to plug in your vehicle, but they're all Tesla. And we finally found the 2 out of about 40 that will recharge a Chevy Bolt, like so the poor people. Which
Climate insincere politician right here. Not enough Bolt chargers.
Yeah, which I'm paying for on time. But so anyway, but I don't care. Elon Musk did an amazing thing, and so I mean, I used to kind of poo-poo Elon Musk, and now I'm like, what am I saying? Like, he figured out, who comes to Whistler? Get the wealthier people who this is part of their lifestyle. And so Whistler, more than anything, is in a great position to say we're phasing out parking spaces for gasoline vehicles. Or it's going to go down by 5% per year, total parking spaces. And you give people lots of warning. That means, oh, good, it's 20 years before, and also the federal government's requiring us to buy those. But you become part of the solution. Mm-hmm. You become one of those steps along the way. But I'm not saying this is easy, and I know that. So I'm always sympathetic to politicians. A very good friend of mine is Ken Melamed, and parking was an issue for him in his defeat. And I always get him to come and speak to my students about that and what he learned from when he was the mayor of Whistler. So I think. But you could be starting campaigns that you got young people involved in, for example, with all of that burning, it's natural gas or propane outside, which is like a crime in a climate emergency, and you're part of it. So what I've said to people is the next thing I'm going to get arrested for is I'm actually going to be chained in Vancouver to the doors of a luxury car dealership. Because that's the thing, like, how can we be selling cars that are to people who we know can afford an electric, who can afford an expensive Tesla, but instead they're driving a $70,000, whatever it is, Mercedes or Porsche. And so Whistler can be part of that dynamic. And so I'm not an expert in marketing, but it could be part of your cachet. Say, we're leaders out here, just as the question said, Hamilton Hills or whatever that was.
Yeah.
Ithaca.
You in your book, you talk about Macron losing popular support as a result of tough decisions, and I think Ken is a great example of the same, because that was a very difficult decision. But every time someone like me has a conversation about the lever that parking is, the opportunity to have the pendulum swing and climate sincere I mean, I don't know too many people that are more climate sincere than Ken Melamed lose elections. And I'm wondering about, how do climate sincere people remain elected?
Yeah. So that's
a personal question. And will you work on my campaign?
Yeah, there's no self-interest here.
Yeah.
Well, so for example, I love this question because I do speak a lot to politicians who are in power or trying to get in power, or trying to stay in power. And I'm someone, because of how my career has evolved, that I've moved more and more onto the real politics side. So I will be looking at policies on the basis of the 905. So that's the area outside Toronto. They all have the same area code. That swings every federal election. And so you have to decide, and I know you think this through, but the good politicians do. They say, what can work for the swing voters I have? And I think in a community, it's a little different than multiple constituencies. But for example, if you were to still try to do that, to me, it would be, I'm going to do it with the visitors to Whistler. I'm not going to do it to Whistler citizens who vote. I'm going to do it with the big parking lots for skiing. But I'm going to advertise this everywhere. And you know what? It won't be hard for people who are coming to ski, even people from Vancouver increasingly, because of what's going on with electric vehicles, but even the ones who are renting a car or coming from Washington. There was a lot of Teslas there in the parking lot with different license plates and so on. So you're already getting that. And I'm talking about something that you don't. The other thing is, and with Ken, if I recall this correctly, I'm always talking about gradualism. Like you announce this big thing and you say, between now and then, we're not waiting till then. It's happening, but it's happening in these increments. And the early increments don't bind. So it's not bad. Yeah. Like there are that many, there's 10% of the spaces are reserved for electric vehicles. Well, almost 10% of the vehicles coming are. So there's policies like that, and where you think about the constituency. So, and you should never blame your politician if they think that way. It's like, I want a purist politician. That's what I teased Ken about. And I mean, but Ken is so honest and like he's fantastic with my students to explain the politics side of it. Yeah. So yes, and that's why I'll say to people, well, why I'll defend Justin Trudeau buying the Trans Mountain Pipeline, because he did it so we wouldn't be in a national unity fight with Alberta. I'm certain of that, by the way. And so, but he got blamed as being climate insincere, and it cost him votes out here. It cost him some votes like everywhere. But he had to try to fit, and it didn't help him that much in Alberta, because for heaven's sakes, it was like some people said, so you're always doing a political calculus because we're in a democracy. It's a pluralistic society. A lot of your citizens don't believe what you believe. And you just kind of have to go with that and try to nudge them towards you and be ready to make compromises and to think strategically on the political side.
We are over time, and so I'll ask you another question.
Love it. Good.
One last question, and then we do need to go. This is from Brendan Ladner. It says, what are the strongest actions a municipality like Whistler can take given jurisdictional issues?
Yeah, so I would say, I mean, the good thing is you're in a province that is already essentially zero emission electricity. And so don't create a microgrid or something, you're on the grid. I used to take my students to the Fitzsimmons Creek facility as well. Or I think it was or even when we used to get a tour before the Aspen people bought it, or whatever, the Blackcomb, yeah, Vale. Some guy who used to always give my students a tour up in the mountain.
Arthur Dijon?
Yeah, Arthur.
Well, he's right there. So.
Well, I would tease Arthur, like you'd say, well, there's this electricity now, so that's part of Whistler. And I'd be like, no, isn't it going into the grid? So that was the good fun we had. And you were, of course, honest about that. And so what I would do is I would say, so actually I chaired the BC Utilities Commission in the 1990s and tried to stop a natural gas line from coming up here. You had propane at the time.
Yeah.
So now you do need to phase out the use of natural gas in buildings. And that's not easy though.
Yeah.
So I mean, I work a lot with the city of Vancouver. Matt Horn was there. There are people that you can lean on that can help you a little bit, but I know you don't have the kind of control over building codes and things that a city like Vancouver has. The other big one is really going to be vehicles.
Yeah.
And you're lucky now because you're in a province where the provincial government and now in a country where the federal government is moving in that direction. So the question is, are there things you can do to accelerate it in your community, to nudge it faster forward? And then and imagine if you could get some of the hotels, even just the symbolism to this outside heating, like to what extent could there be some low emission stoves out there? Or when you heat rocks, there's ways to heat a rock, and then you give off some heat, but you also give out blankets to people and they're well covered and they drink good cheer. Yeah, blankets.
Innovative idea, Mark.
Yeah. Which often in Europe, I go out to a cafe and I sit down and someone puts a blanket on me. So, I mean, surely people in Whistler could do that. Oh.
Mark, this was fascinating, and I just feel like we don't have enough time with you. I could sit here all night and listen to you share with us this book. Unfortunately, supply chains don't let us get them here tonight to be able to sell them to you, but you can and do and should buy them online. So please do. I want to thank you all for coming tonight. I think you'll agree that this was an engaging and vital and important conversation for us to continue to have. Again, thank you to Mark for all you've done for this town and to keep coming back. We're grateful. We'll have to have you back maybe next week. We'd love to have you. We want to thank Aware, Whistler's environmental charity, who have signage in the foyer and have done a lot of very good work for this town. You can please get involved in the Small Steps for Big Moves program, which is just trying to get our community to take this on as families and individuals and do our part each month. There's a different action that people can take, and we hope you'll join us in doing that. I encourage you to check that out at whistler.ca/small steps for big moves. Thank you once again to our sponsors, Cascade Environmental Resource Group, RDC Fine Homes, BD Living, Peak News Magazine, Cronin Family, Whistler Lake Conservation Association, Race and Company, and Stark Architecture. As we look forward to 2022, the Whistler Institute has a bunch of, I think, really exciting events that are coming our way. Do pay attention tomorrow to the news. There will be an announcement about the 2030 Olympic Games. And we will be having conversation at the Whistler Institute about the future of the Olympic movement in the spring. And we'll be hoping that you'll all come back and join us again for that event. We wish you all a wonderful festive season. And I hope that you take time tonight to enjoy each other, whether you're having dinner with us over at Carumba or just enjoying the people that you have come with. Let's have this conversation more often. Let's start continuing the move that was started by people that have put in good work long before all of us. We have to pick up that legacy and move it forward and kind of finish the work. There's lots and lots and lots to do. So Mark, one more thank you from me. I'm grateful that you took the time with us tonight.
Thanks for having me. Thank you. Thank you.
Enjoy your evening.